how you define a problem leads very much to the kinds of solutions that you might be interested in, and also the kinds of actors and people that you might want to talk to as well. So really dwelling and thinking about where we are in defining the problem, I think, can be a good place to start. Then I will talk to you a bit about public opinion, ask you as well what you think about public opinion, and then move into all the answers. Now, I mean, I don't have all the answers, but we can, I can explain how I begin to think about some of the solutions. So firstly, what is the problem? So I'm going to present two kinds of problem framing. So one is this idea that it's who's responsible for climate change? Is it individuals? Is it essentially that it's the all carbon emissions come from everyday activities, our behaviours, our millions of choices, what we choose to eat, how we choose to travel, and essentially governments and businesses and corporations are there to service our needs. We elect politicians who represent us, we buy the products and services that we want from these organisations, and thus the solution might lie in engaging all of those individuals and thinking about those behaviours. Another side of that problem framing is very different, which is to say that actually all of those individual choices are contained within a system. They're bounded by the rules, the marketing, the advertising, the vested interests that businesses have, that actually this is, it's the system that shapes us. And sometimes you can see this played out in like psychology versus sociology. Those are kind of similar, different, along these lines anyway. And so therefore the solutions are, data centres, big offshore wind farms engage with changing the system. Now, it's easy to say, oh, this is an artificial binary. These are clearly two sides of the same coin. But I'm going to, I think, show you that this still plays out all the time. It hasn't gone away, and it actually, you can see it in climate discourse. So one example is back in 2018, when Twitter still existed. I can see Twitter still exists on your thing. CNN said, are you scared by that latest report? Here's what you can do to help. Eat less meat, take sustainable transport, or use less energy at home. And in the good old days of Twitter, they got lots of replies, and here was one kind of typical reply, which is to say, there was a report around this time saying, attributing all of 71% of emissions to just 100 companies. And that's a very clear example of the two problem things, I think. And another one, also on Twitter, BP saying, promoting the idea of the individual carbon footprint. They built a calculator, they put it on their website, and they had a whole marketing campaign encouraging their customers to change their behaviours. And I really like this response. And then there's been quite a lot of criticism and backlash around particularly BP's contribution here, and this was a very widely read opinion piece in the New York Times saying, this is exactly what they want you to do. They want to shift the blame onto individuals, onto their customers, and stop the blame being on them. And some people go, I think, a bit too far and actually say that BP invented the carbon footprint, which is just not true, but they certainly they helped to popularise it, particularly in the 2000s. So, another example, I don't know, you may have seen this, but I hope it's going to play for us with sound. Okay, that's not very loud.
To be a good green, but it's all bold.
You should be able to hear it just from the laptop.
I'm vegan, I don't drive, I don't fly, I do everything you need to be a good green, but it's all bollocks. I only don't do that stuff because I don't want to be called a hypocrite by the right-wing shock jock, so I make sacrifices in my life because I have the power and privilege to do so I just go, you know what, it's easier to do the right thing and it's good to do the right thing. But there's no reason why someone can't do all of those individual responsibilities and not be an environmentalist and not give a shit about the planet. Like the problem of the corporations that are destroying our environment, they're destroying our democracy, and they're destroying our communities. And they have done a job over on the entire world in the 70s when they came up with this idea of carbon footprint.
actually, there's some interesting dynamics here. Maybe there's quite a lot of discussion on social media about what all this meant and what he really means, because he's clearly is not quite, I don't quite buy it. I think it's a political move, and because clearly individual behaviour is something he's taken very, very seriously. But nonetheless, it's, I think, an illustration of how these different problems of worldviews play out. Now I'm going to give you another example. Oops. Okay. So this is another set of problem frames that I have seen based on working at Oxford University for the last 10 years. And I should say that apparently we have more researchers working on energy and climate change than any other university in the world. So it's a good place to see these discourses play out. And the first problem framing is to say that we have a pollution problem, we have a greenhouse gas problem, and that's a big problem. We need to transform our economies and our societies, and let's focus on that. Because if we try to solve all our other problems at the same time, we will end up doing a lot of talking and get little done. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And then the other problem framing is actually climate change and GHG emissions are a symptom of a wider problem, and that wider problem is fundamentally about the relationship that humans have with our natural environment. And so if we only focus on CO2 or greenhouse gases, we'll not address any of the root causes of environmental destruction. So they might point to different kinds of evidence. This is the Keeling curve, which is one of the oldest data sets for relevant to climate change. So it's a station in Hawaii where they collect atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And as you can see, it's you don't see any signs of the Paris Agreement. You don't see any even signs of COVID. It's a pretty clear signal. And then they also might point to the various failings at the international level. The frustration. I think this photo was. I think that was Copenhagen, which ended in not very much. And there's a lot of talking and not very much changes. On the other hand, climate change is not the only crisis we face. This bottom right graph shows how wildlife has declined, both biodiversity and biomass has declined steadily over the last few years. And the Gini coefficient is a measure of social inequality, which you can see in France, the UK, China, and the US has been increasing since the 1980s. So they would say that we have a whole bunch of other problems to solve, and if we just tried to, we'd say we had a magic CCS carbon capture solution that had no downsides, look how many other problems we'd still have. And so they do lead to different kinds of solutions, as I say, and different who we need to engage with. So if you are really serious about getting CO2 down, then you probably end up with a conversation where carbon capture and storage is very much part of it. And who do we need to talk to about that? It's probably the oil majors, because they're the ones that have the expertise to do so. And one of my colleagues at Oxford, Miles Allen, is a real proponent of this idea that we should mandate the polluter pays, right? So that we should mandate all of the oil companies to sequester the waste that they produce. And that is a question of dealing with a small number of actors, and that's really a system. Change the system, don't change millions or billions of individuals. On the other hand, if you see climate change as a symptom of a wider set of challenges, then you can't disentangle it. The Sustainable Development Goals, climate action is one of them, and they're all intertwined, so the solution needs to be everything together. And so therefore, then you get ideas and messages like this, that climate justice is social justice. Okay. So, just to finish, coming back to the individual, that actually makes us, as communities and individuals trying to do the right thing, it leads us down different roads, right? So, do you think about your own personal behaviours, like flying and eating beef, which are some of the most impactful, or do you do some kind of focus on public sphere behaviours that might do something to change the system, or actually the kind of community level? So allotments, share Oxford, these kinds of things. Actually, let's not forget the meso scale, which is actually where a lot of good can happen, because amplified voices, that's, you can, well, we'll come back to that. Okay, so I normally, when I do this, I ask students to get out their phones and vote on an app, but I think I'd like to just get a show of hands. So let's take the first problem set, individual versus system. So, and it's unfair, but for the fun of it, put your hand up if you subscribe to Zach Polanski's view of the world, which is that it's a system problem. And that's the majority, I think. And anyone on the other side, it's an individual, collective individual problem? Okay.
Can we do both?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not allowed. Okay. I'm glad that there was, sometimes it's all on one. So I'm glad there was a bit of disagreement. And then on the other, so do we have a CO2 problem that we definitely need to focus all our minds on? Or do we have a bigger problem that might end up doing a lot of talking, but is probably the more real? So let's vote for the first one. So we have a pollution problem that we really need to focus our minds on. Okay, and that's only a symptom. We've got a much bigger problem. Okay, thank you. I like this. This is a split down the middle, and I'm sure, I hope, yeah, the kinds of things that can generate conversation. So I often do this at the beginning of the academic year. Okay, and what I'll just introduce here, so in my own research, I use this framework called carbon capability, which, as you can see from the diagram, tries to bring the two together, because it is remarkable, actually. It's kind of obvious that they're two sides of the same coin and you should do them together, but it's remarkable within research theory and practice that doesn't happen. You know, there are very few really integrative frameworks, and partly that's, as I say, the disciplinary traditions around psychology, which is all about individuals, sociology, which is all about systems, etc. So it's kind of baked into the system. So this is a truly interdisciplinary approach, and it's defined as an individual's ability, motivation, and knowledge to make informed decisions and take effective action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, both through their personal behaviour and collective action. And so someone's carbon capability comes down to their knowledge, their skills, their education, etc. But it also recognises that you can have all of that and still be someone who, you know, that can't do very much. Maybe you're in a rented property, you live in the countryside, etc. And so yeah, I've applied this in various ways amongst different populations. So just to give you one example, we wrote a paper exploring the carbon capabilities of wealthy people in the UK, so the top 10% earners, and yeah, found some interesting things. Okay, so public support for behaviour change. So I'm going to ask you to a bit more audience participation. So there's a statement: to tackle climate change, we as a society need to drastically change the way we live and how society operates. So what proportion of people in the UK do you think would agree with that statement? Just have some guesses.
10%.
10%.
60.
60%.
70%.
70.
30.
80.
32.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So we have the full range. Yes. Okay. And next, okay. By a show of hands, would you be willing to give up 1% of your household income every month to fight climate change?
Yeah.
It's a little bit like not anonymous, but yeah, the majority, I think, would say put their hand. Now, what percentage of people in the UK do you think would agree to do the same? So let's say 90% of this room did, but what percentage of the UK? 30, 10, 5,
40.
Okay, so you all care about climate change much. That's obvious because we're here, and so, but you think quite a lot. Okay. And just out of interest, globally, is it how would you attribute that number? Lower than the UK? Higher than the UK? Lower. Lower than the UK. Okay. Right. Okay, so you might be interested in the results. So To tackle climate change, we as a society need to drastically change the way we live and how society operates. My colleagues asked this in 4 countries, and 70% of people in the UK either strongly or tend to agree with that statement. And then, interestingly, similarly high in Sweden, Brazil, and China. They selected the countries for being very different. Okay, and then also some other lifestyle changes, so the kinds of things that matter, like eating less red meat, minimising air travel, reducing meat purchases, and reducing energy at home, similarly very high levels of support. Notably slightly lower around eating less red meat than minimising air travel and the rest. Okay, so high levels of public support for the idea that we should change. And then here's the really interesting graph, which is, so the question about 1% of your income was asked to 130,000 people across 125 countries, and every single country is below the diagonal, right? So in the x-axis, the actual share who said they were willing to give up 1%. On average, the world was 69% of people said yes, and then they asked everyone, what percentage of people in your country would do the same, and the average guess was 42%. And the UK is not as generous as the world, actually. So ours was about 48% said yes, and they estimated about 38% of other people. And then you can see some outliers as well. Denmark is more generous, but it's not. It doesn't really track with wealth. That's important. So everyone underestimates how much other people are say they're willing. This is hypothetical, obviously, but everyone thinks that they are more generous or more. They care about climate change more and willing to make personal sacrifices. So this is known as something called pluralistic ignorance. Pluralistically, together we are ignorant about each other. And it's not something you just see in climate, but it's particularly pronounced in climate. Everyone is also a better than average driver and more intelligent than average as well. Okay, but to me this does speak to a wider problem, which is that climate change is not prominent enough. People think that it matters to them. In fact, they might even be willing to use their vote for it, but it's not enough in the public discourse, and therefore it's not enough in the campaigning of politicians. Okay, so yes, as I'm sure you can guess, actual reported behaviour and lifestyle change remains modest. So in a paper that we published a couple of years ago, we repeated the same questions around around behaviours as a survey in 2008, and you can see that there's very incremental change. So people say that in blue, the later 2022, people are saying they're switching off lights in rooms more often, they're recycling more often, they buy products with less packaging a lot more often, although that's kind of relative, less packaging than what, not a particularly brilliant phrase. Reducing the amount of flying is interesting because apparently people do that more, but we also know people fly a lot more than they did in 2008. And vegetarianism is still pretty small. Interestingly, the kind of public sphere behaviours, protesting and writing to a politician, very low numbers, but increasing. This was just post-COVID, which was a peak of writing to your MP because people had nothing else to do, and it was a real peak of that kind of activity. But yes, a bit incremental, sadly. And yes, why do low impact actions dominate? They're easier on the whole, but there is something to be said about misperceptions as well. So Ipsos did this study called Peril of Perceptions. They asked, from this list of options, which 3 do you think would most reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of an individual living in a rich country? And you can see most commonly ranked high was recycling, buying renewable energy, buying EV, and least popular was having one fewer child, which is a whole, it's very problematic, and I think I probably wouldn't have included it. It's a very different kind of category. But you can see the actual rank there in terms of its impact, and it's almost inverse, right? So recycling, not very impactful, not having a car, very impactful, avoiding flying, very impactful. So there's a sense in which people don't quite get it, and that is, who knows, it's lack of education or it's motivated reasoning, but it's also perhaps this function of pluralistic ignorance in that people are not talking about this enough. There isn't enough discussion about what we can do as individuals. And of course, it goes without saying that structural barriers are critical. Buying an EV, upfront capital is a key barrier, and you know, avoiding flying, well, trains remain very expensive compared to flying, etc. So structural barriers shouldn't be underestimated. And in another paper, this is kind of the obvious, but we tried to group influences on individual green choices, and essentially tried to say there are 4 types of influence. Individual factors like psychology, values, traits, digital skills, etc. But also demographics, so age, ethnicity even, and education. Social influences like really important social and cultural norms. This is what we found with rich people, very powerful social norms to consume lots. And then also social capital, which is something that you guys are absolutely generating by having being in low carbon lots of north. Of course, then you have the structural things, material infrastructures, transport systems, urban planning, having an out-of-town shopping centre, which ties everyone into driving, and then lastly, political influence. So, democracy versus non-democracies. What is possible? What is possible to do as an individual is completely influenced by all of those kind of governance arrangements. So, how can we build on the fact that people report high levels of concern and commitment to actually lead to meaningful climate action? I'm afraid I'm not going to tell you exactly the answer to that question, because I think that is the killer question. But I think I would start by just kind of giving you more. I'm an academic, so here's some frameworks for thinking about this rather than the actual this is the answer. So firstly, I think it's worth saying that we can think about individuals as more than just consumers. A lot of attention goes on to what we buy and what we consume, and understandably so, because that is where our individual carbon footprints come from. But it's important to say that what we do with our money and our savings, our pensions, matters too. How we influence others as role models, so in our using our platforms, whether that's social media or whether it's even just amongst family and friends, is crucial. I'm going to tell you a bit later about some work I've done with hairdressers, for instance. And we are, many of us, part of organisations, whether that's volunteer organisations or professional in jobs, so mobilising within those environments is key, and then using our power as citizens is vital too. So thinking creatively about the different kinds of activities that we can do is a good start. And we, Ray Whitmarsh and I, converted this into a framework that was meant to be just quite accessible, and someone told me recently they printed out and put it on their fridge, which made me very happy. And so these are what we call the 6 domains of climate action, and the 4 lighter colours along the top are the consumption domain. So these are the 4 main components of a typical carbon footprint: food, energy in the home, transport, and the things we buy. And then the darker segments are those kind of non-consumption activities, like influencing through talking or volunteering or making career choices is one of the big things that young people can do. And and citizenship activities too. So just to focus a little bit on talking, because I feel like it's a really key activity. This is Catherine Hayhoe, a climate physicist in the US, but she's made her name actually more from this public engagement stuff. And this is her giving a TED talk where she says, if you're going to do one action for climate change, it's talk about it. That's the most important action. We did a survey in 2022, the same survey that I already showed you, about how often people talk and different types of people talk about climate. And there are some kind of unsurprising and surprising things. At the time, the Brexit Party, you would expect, said they didn't talk about it. They were least likely to talk about it. Green Party voters, most likely to talk. And then you have some patterns like younger people, some ethnic minorities, interestingly more likely, and income's a bit all over the place, but actually some high earners much more likely than low earners to talk about climate change. And women slightly more likely as well. And there are lots of great kind of guidelines out there and frameworks for how to have climate conversations with different kinds of people, including Climate Outreach, who I think are no longer based in Oxford, but they were born in Oxford. Yes, and so here's a framework, another framework that I would like to say I found quite useful. This is the theory of basic human values. So this comes from psychology, this idea that we can basically categorize people according to their fundamental values. There's a set of set questions that you can ask people, and the idea of values is they're something that's really developed in your childhood and they're core and they don't change. And there are 10 types. As you can see, they're categorized into self-transcendent values versus self-enhancement. The idea that those are quite in opposition, openness to change versus conservation values. And this was just something we were trying to do in engaging small businesses, some work that I've been doing, making the point that there is no set of values that's incompatible with caring about climate change or taking action. But the ways in which you engage those different audiences definitely will be different. And so the kind of language and messages is really crucial. And this is where climate conversations and understanding kind of the ripple effect of everyday influence. How do we overcome climate silence, overcome pluralistic ignorance, to get more people talking about climate change and different kinds of people? So it's not just people who, the familiar people in this room probably. And so I've been particularly interested in how do we find these groups of influential people. And the great thing nowadays is that in every community there are people who are passionate about climate change, and that includes hairdressers. So we went out to the Green Salon Collective, which is a community of hairdressers up and down the country who care about climate change. They do various things to reduce energy and water consumption and chemicals and even foils, and they recycle hair. They do creative things with all of their hair. But one of the things that they do also is try and, they build on the fact that they're famous for talking to people, and they try and build climate into their everyday conversations. And we worked with some colleagues at Southampton who did this lovely intervention, which is they put these stickers on the mirror with QR codes, and they would be conversation starters. So you'd scan it and it would give you a fact or something to talk about with your hairdresser. And we interviewed a lot of these people, and we had a paper that explores all the ways in which they use or struggle to use their influence. And yeah, they said we are really underrepresented and underestimated as influencers. They think we can basically influence you to do what we want you to do, but also they're very good at reading people. That's what they're constantly reading people. You may find that they misread you, but they are trying to judge the right kind of conversation to have with the right kind of person. And so we've expanded that in ongoing work to think about other kinds of everyday influences. Here's a couple of examples, but there are many more. You can think of taxi drivers, football coaches, all kinds of people who interact. Physiotherapists are really important as well. But we've done a project just recently finished with the National Childbirth Trust. Antenatal trainers, really important. So this was on the back of a paper that we did exploring the carbon capability of new parents and how that's such a key moment where life changes, energy consumption often goes up, people often buy a new car, there's lots of things that happen at that stage of life, and therefore it's a really good time to intervene. And actually, even better if you can go pre-birth, you can start building, because there's also a kind of emotional well-being moment there, which is, and actually we found in this paper that fathers found this even more than mothers. Mothers maybe had a lot on their plate. Fathers were thinking much more existentially about the future of the planet. What, this child is going to be alive in 2100, and they begin to think about climate change. So we've done some work with the trainers, and then the Women's Institute as one of the most well-known, powerful political voices in the country. The amazing thing about Women's Institute is they get prime ministers coming to their AGM because they know that these people are seriously influential. So this is Sue Smith, who's based in Banbury and is a climate ambassador. Again, I say in every community there are people who care passionately about climate change. So she goes around all the Oxfordshire WIs talking about climate and trying to mobilise people. And she's done some great thinking about, on the back of that documentary about the water, it was a dramatisation, wasn't it, of Thames water issues. She does this great thing of finding where all of the discharges in their local WI area, shows them a map of it, gets people angry, and then mobilised. Okay, and then lastly, as well as leadership in the community, it's also very important to have leadership at the higher levels. And in the Environmental Change Institute, we have this new centre called Climate Leadership Research Centre, where we're going to be working with high-profile politicians, international athletes and business leaders to tackle this problem, because this is a very real problem for a lot of people. They see leaders with very high-carbon lifestyles. They see influencers on Instagram, showing off about their consumption. So why should I change if those with power and influence and money are not? And there are some fantastic people doing the opposite of that. You wouldn't maybe have thought of Arnold Schwarzenegger, but he has this pump for the planet. There are professional football players who are speaking up and using their platform. This guy is a current, what's he called, Morten Thorsby. He is a current Norwegian football player going to the World Cup, and he created an organisation all around mobilising football players around climate. And this was a campaign that they did, which was to try and engage men of a certain age through trout fishing. He kind of created all this content. Obviously, the fact that he's a nationally famous football player helped. And then David Pocock, ex-rugby captain for Australia, the nemesis of England, is now a senator in Australia and very vocal on climate. So there are some great opportunities, great leaders out there, and we're trying to create more, essentially. So, to conclude, the role of individual climate action, I think, is very contested. You find some people, like Zach Delancey, saying it's all bollocks. I don't think that's true. I think in one sentence I would say why. Systemic change needs public support. There's no way we're going to change the system if we don't actually engage all the individuals in the country too. And maybe I haven't said as much as I might have done about the meso scale, the community scale, but I do think it's absolutely crucial because it's where we can overcome climate silence, it's where these conversations happen. It's that communities can be powerful in exerting pressure upwards. There are places that you can demonstrate, and I know you've done lots of work on this, demonstrate the solutions, open homes, rooftop solar, these kinds of things, and yeah, motivating and mobilising individuals. Okay, so yeah, here's some showing off papers that we've studied, that we've done, but I can provide you with references if that would be interesting. So Thank you very much.